All right, part three. So I was telling you that after Alan Shepard's suborbital flight of 15 minutes, that President Kennedy called on the United States to send a man to the moon. Okay, within by the end of the decade, which was, like I said, truly an audacious goal. And Congress responds. Okay, we remember, look at this as a Cold War thing. All right, you know, the Soviets have beaten us. Okay, uh, Congress responds. Money flows into NASA. Okay, uh, I mean everything's. This is quite a deal. I mean some stuff has already been kind of penciled in, but oh my gosh, I mean it's not just building rockets. You got to build launch pads, facilities, and ways to get rockets that haven't been designed yet into across the country. And it's quite a logistical feat. Okay, we do eventually get an American into orbit in 1962. So not quite a year after Shepard had flown. So Shepard flew, Grissom repeated his flight. In February of 1962, yes, this is after Kennedy set his goal, we do successfully launch an astronaut into orbit. Okay, and this is John Glenn. Okay, his name's not on here, but it's John, John, Glenn, Glenn. John Glenn. He's a Marine. Okay, and he's launched into orbit and actually orbits the Earth 3 times. Okay, so flight takes a few hours. Okay, and so now we've caught up with the Soviets as far as being able to orbit astronauts into space. Okay, and so John Glenn is probably at certainly the time the most famous of the original 7 astronauts. Okay, and he becomes a big American hero for good reason, because he is. He later becomes a senator. Okay, from Ohio, I think. Anyway, he's a senator for a long time. Okay, and so NASA's starts working on getting things set up to try to go to the moon. They start developing a spacecraft, and there's already been some preliminary sketches done up of this. It'll become known as Apollo. Okay, all right, and this will eventually be the moon ship. Okay, so it was already kind of being sketched out prior to Kennedy deciding to go to the moon. It wasn't designed from I don't think the plan. It goes through several major redesigns, but they're already starting to think about the concepts, like a 3-man crew, for instance. Okay, you could stay up for long times, do things and shift, that kind of stuff. Okay, all right, and obviously if you're going to start flying capsules with 3 men aboard, you're going to need more astronauts. You can't just keep using the same 7 guys. Plus, one of the 7's been grounded by a heart condition. So now you really only have 6. And then, it's just not enough. Okay, so NASA will pick 9 more astronauts in 1962. So, like I said, NASA will pick 9 more astronauts. Let me get my next slide here. Okay. So here's a picture. The original 7 astronauts are sitting down at the table, and the new 9 standing behind them. So now there are 16 astronauts. Okay, but like I said, one's actually been grounded medically, and then one's probably not going to fly again because they weren't happy with his flight, etc. We eventually flew 6 Mercury flights. Okay, the longest one lasted like 24 hours. So 6 of the 7 original astronauts each flew 1 Mercury mission, and then they decided to retire from the Mercury program because they really felt they'd gotten all they could out of it. Okay, and so these new 9 astronauts are selected, and they're actually very, very significant. I won't bother to try to name them all for you. That would be silly. Okay, but several of these guys will eventually, let's see, walk on the moon. Let's see. At least 2 of them walked on the moon. 3. 3? 2. Anyway, I fell down the rabbit hole. And so now we're working on this. Now NASA decides it's going to be a while before the Apollo 3-man craft is ready. Okay, it's a huge leap from a Gemini 1 seat to a Apollo 3 seat, and they'll realize they need like an interim program, okay, to bridge the gap. Okay, I'll talk about that here in a second. Okay, but if you look at really old books, I remember when I was like in junior high looking at a book that talked about Mercury and it talked about Apollo. It didn't even mention the intermediate program because actually Apollo was on the books first. But we realized we're going to need even more astronauts. Okay, so they'll pick a group of 14. Okay? All right. Now this is kind of a hard luck group. Okay, because 4 of these people will die in plane crashes and accidents. Okay. So anyway, the reason I'm telling you this though. Okay, so I told you there were 7. And there were 9, that's 16, and then there's 14, that's 30. Okay? So suppose I told you that the entire manned space program up to the point of the first lunar landing, which I'm assuming you all know we landed on the moon. I'm kind of giving away the story here, right? By the time we get to the first lunar landing, every flight that's flown is by these 30 guys. It's how small of a group of people we're talking about. There's a small enough group of people that there actually can be like characters in a book. Okay, and I told you, one's grounded for medical reasons from the original 7, never flies. A couple guys died in an airplane crash, and another guy dies in an airplane crash. And then another guy's killed in 2 people are killed in like a spacecraft fire. So some of the 30 never do fly. Okay. Or they had some roles to play, training and preparing things, etc., etc. Okay, so I've said you got 30. Subtract 1, 2, 3. I think 4 of it die. 1 that's grounded. It's really like 25 guys. So the entire American manned space program, from the first flight up to the first moon landing, is basically 24 guys, 24 astronauts. Okay. So you can really actually, if you're a real space geek, you can actually kind of keep track of them. There's just that few. You can, like, they have like characters. Like this is the guy who's, you have a hard luck guy, and here's the, here's the Boy Scout, and here's this. So anyway, now later there'll be more astronauts because as you continue to expand the program, you'll pull more people in. After the 14. There's a group of 19, and then they get some scientists. But we're going to stop with the 30 because that's the group that gets us through the first lunar landing. Okay. All right. So I told you we start working on setting up this Apollo program, but you have to build the ships from scratch. You got to build the infrastructure. And so they decide that they do need some kind of interim program where they can continue to develop ideas. Okay. By the way, the Soviets were the first people to send a multi-man spacecraft into space. They sent up a 3-man spaceship, okay, to beat us to the punch. Now the way they did this is they stripped the ship down and sent them up without spacesuits, but they got 3 men crammed into a spacecraft and sent them up. Okay. They also did the first spacewalk, so they keep beating us to things. Now, the Soviets never really acknowledged that they were going to race us to the moon. Okay, as an aside here, they never publicly announced it. Now, with the fall of the Soviet Union and access to some of the records, we find that they did dabble with the idea. They built some prototype ships. They were working on getting the bugs out, but they never really pursued it as hard as we did. And so they kind of pretended that it just didn't happen. The Soviets became more interested in putting up a space station. Okay, so we're pursuing going to the moon. They're pursuing going to a space station. But they did, like I said, mess around with the idea of going to the moon. But I think they decided we were so far ahead we would beat them. So they just pretended they weren't interested in going at all, to where they could, well, we didn't really lose the race to the moon because we were never really in a race to the moon. But yeah, really they were toying with the idea. All right? So anyway, the next slide should be a Gemini probably. Yes. Okay. So the interim space program is called the Gemini series, as in the twins, because it's a 2-man spacecraft. Okay. This was a very exciting program. They flew 10-man flights in 2 years. Okay, and each flight did something new, pretty much. Or well, the last three basically kind of repeated themselves, but they got further along. Okay, so I mean, the first flight they just make sure the thing can fly. The second flight we did a spacewalk, mainly because the Soviets had done one. Then there was an endurance mission for 8 days, which is how long it takes to get to the moon and back, to see if could two guys live for 8 days in a spacecraft that's about as big as the front seat of your car. Okay, and then one of the big things they had to work out was the whole idea of rendezvous, because we've decided that the way to go to the moon, and I won't bore you with all the details, but the only way to do this easily is to send two ships, have a smaller lander. Now they sketched out some ideas. Could you land an Apollo spacecraft on the moon? But it would have been so big, so heavy, so awkward, hard to fly. Yeah, it would have taken a huge booster. And so they kicked around several different scenarios on how to pull it off. And one they came up with was use a separate lander that could then be discarded after the landing. So if you're going to have two ships, they have to be able to find themselves in space. This is called a rendezvous. Okay? Which is a lot trickier than you might think. Okay, how do you bring two little tiny spacecrafts together in the same place at the same time? This is one of the big things that Gemini worked on. Okay. Oh, here's Ed White. So this is a very famous photo. It's a great photo. You know, the suit is crystal clear white, and the Earth is blue, and it's just beautiful. And he walks in space in 1965 after the Soviets had done it. We probably wouldn't have walked that early, but the Soviets had done it, so we had to show that we could do it too. Okay. All right. But here's the thing that's one of the things Gemini is known for is the rendezvous. Okay. I remember it was actually one mission. It was a joint mission of Gemini 6 and Gemini 7, where the two Gemini craft actually came together in Earth orbit and met up with each other. It was a very long, complicated story that I won't go into because you can read about it if you want. But one ship took off, the other ship took off later, chased the first ship down, caught up with them, proved that it could be done. Okay? Now, after this flight, there were several flights with Agena target vehicles, which had a big rocket on the end. They would launch these things when they worked, which sometimes they didn't. And then the astronauts would chase them down in Earth orbit. You could dock with them, which is another thing you had to be able to do to use two ships in space, is join them together. And you could fire off this engine and take the Gemini up into a higher orbit. Okay, so this was done on. They tried to do it on Gemini 8. They docked. There was a malfunction. It's an emergency. If you saw the movie First Man, has a whole scene about that. 8, 9 couldn't dock. There was a mechanical malfunction. 10, 11, 12 actually managed to pull it off and do the final steps of what they were trying to do. So the Gemini program was a very exciting, every flight, breaking new boundaries type of program. Okay, so coming up on near my time limit on recordings, so I'll stop here and we'll come back with Apollo.